In this video, we'll be looking at the special properties of water and why is it so important to life. We learned in the last lecture at the very end that water is a very polar molecule, meaning it behaves like a tiny magnet, and that's going to give it some really, really special properties. The first one is that it's less dense as a solid than it is as a liquid. This is very odd compared to most things. Most things are the least dense as a gas, and then as you cool it and it condenses to a liquid, it gets more dense, and then as you cool it even more and it becomes a solid, it becomes even more dense. This is not the case for water. Water actually becomes less dense as it gets colder and freezes to a solid. That has some very important ramifications. You've experienced this. If you ever put a bottle of water in the fridge, or I'm sorry, in the freezer, and then you forget about it, and the next thing you know, your bottle is completely broken, or maybe it's just like really puffed out. The reason for that is because it's taking up more space as a solid than it did when it was a liquid in the bottle. Now, why is this? Why does this actually happen? Well, it comes down to the fact that these water molecules are behaving like tiny magnets. So when they're in a liquid state, the molecules are moving at a speed that's enough that though there are hydrogen bonds forming, they're forming and breaking all the time. So the water molecules do tend to clump together, but they don't form any nice crystalline solids because they're just constantly in motion. So this water molecule is moving, and so it forms an interaction here, but then it breaks as it rotates somewhere else. When the water cools, though, and that molecular motion slows down, those hydrogen bonds become more and more important, and eventually the water molecules actually stop moving enough to where they can actually form these interactions, and you'll see that what you form is this very crystalline shape. This would now be ice water, but notice, look how much empty space there is compared to over here. And so as a result, the water takes up less space and it's less dense. This is why your ice cubes float on your liquid water. This picture is essentially showing the same thing. In the liquid, the hydrogen bonds are being broken and reformed, That does have the water molecules stick together, and they're attracted to each other, which water is. But once it freezes, you get these big open spaces because the hydrogen bonds are much more stable. Now, why is this important? Well, imagine if we lived in a world, or in a universe, I should say, where water behaved like most things, and solid ice water was more dense than liquid water. Well, what would happen in the wintertime in a place like, let's say, Minnesota? Well, the ice, it'd get cold in the wintertime, and the surface of the lake would freeze. And then what would this ice do? Well, it would sink to the bottom. And then what would happen to the new layer of water? Well, it would freeze, and that ice would also sink to the bottom, and then so forth. And eventually what would happen is you'd get a thicker and thicker layer of ice at the bottom until the entire lake had frozen over. What happens to all the life in that lake? Well, one would assume that most of it, the vast majority of it, would die. Wouldn't be able to survive that kind of freezing process. And then, of course, in the spring, it'd take a very long time to thaw the very bottom of the pool. In fact, in some areas, you may never actually completely thaw the bottom ice. But that's not what happens in our universe. In our universe, where, because of these important hydrogen bonds in water, water is less dense as a solid than a liquid. So what happens is that the surface water freezes into ice. But what happens then is the rest of the water is insulated by that ice, and so it could drop to, well below freezing out here, and this water will remain liquid, and that allows for life to survive in some, much more. Essentially what this allows for is that it makes much more of our globe habitable to life. Think about all the polar regions, essentially. No life could survive in the liquids there, the lakes and the oceans and whatnot. So this is a very important property for water, though we don't normally think about it. Another special property of water is that it has a very high specific heat capacity. Now, what does this mean? Well, this is a chemistry term, but essentially what it means is that it takes a whole lot of energy to increase the temperature of water a degree Celsius or to cool it a degree Celsius. You've actually experienced this before. Let me draw a wonderful picture here of a pot that you're going to fill with water, and you're going to bring it to boiling. So you've got a flame down here on let's say it's on your stove, right, at home. Now, isn't that a fantastic picture? That's amazing. I impress myself sometimes. Now, you turn that stove on, you got this flame, it's heating the pot. Which part gets hot first? Well, you probably would experience this, that maybe, 5 or 10 minutes, well, let's say at least 5 minutes into boiling this water, you could still easily place your hand in this water and it'll be maybe warm, but certainly not boiling, not hot enough to hurt you. However, in that same 5 minutes, if you were to go ahead and touch the outside of this pot, the pot might be really, really hot and you could burn yourself. Metal has a very, very low specific heat capacity, meaning metal gets really hot and it cools off very fast. It doesn't take a lot of energy and it doesn't take a lot of time to heat or cool metal. That's why we use it in our cooking. And if we continue this example, imagine that after you've heated this water to boiling, so everything's really hot now. The water's boiling hot, the pan is super, super hot. Let's pretend that we take that water out, put it in another container. Okay, so the water's in here now. And so we've taken the water out of here. And then we also have turned off the heat source. So now we're just letting everything cool. So as this stuff cools, which is going to cool faster? Well, maybe 10 minutes later, you'll be able to touch this pan and it'll be totally cool because that metal, again, has a low specific heat, so it cools quickly and it cools essentially faster because it has a lower specific heat capacity. But this water's still going to be pretty hot for a long time. Now, why is this important to life, the fact that water has this really high specific heat capacity? What it means is that water essentially is a great thing to absorb heat energy and then radiate that heat energy. And the fact that the Earth is 71% water is a really nice thing. Essentially what this means is that the oceans act like a gigantic heat sink. They absorb warmth from the sun during the day and they radiate that at night. You're probably familiar with this. Have you ever been out to the desert before? If you've been out to the desert, and especially if you spent the night, maybe a few nights in the desert, what you probably noticed is during the day, it's really, really hot in the desert compared to along the shore here in Solana Beach. Now, why is that? Well, in Solana Beach, we have this beautiful ocean next to us, and it absorbs a lot of the warmth of the sun during the day. You also might have noticed, though, that in the desert, not only does it get really, really hot during the day, but it gets really, really cold at night. So in the desert, if I were looking at the temperatures daily, they look a lot more like this, really kind of violent swings from high to low. Now, why is it that they cool so much in the nighttime? Well, in the nighttime, it's because it doesn't have that water. Along the beach, though, in Solana Beach, the temperature looks more like this, much more like that. And the reason for that is that during the day, when it's hot, the ocean is absorbing a lot of that heat, keeping the highs from getting quite as high. And then at night, that warm water is radiating that heat, keeping us from getting too cold in the evening. Now that makes, the shore is a nice place to live. And if you look at a distribution of human population, you'll find that the vast majority of humans live right along some source of water, especially the oceans. However, it also keeps the Earth in general from getting too hot and too cold and keeps our temperature in general on the planet much more moderate. And that makes life a whole lot easier on this planet. Things don't have to be, either want to use the word designed or adapted to these rapid, fluctuations. There certainly are some organisms that do quite well in the desert, but the reality is the fact that the temperature in general on the Earth is more stable makes things a lot easier for us. And one way this is actually even more interestingly demonstrated is the fact that these oceans that we have, not only do they absorb a lot of water, but they have these really cool currents. You've heard of them maybe as gyres. The North Pacific gyre is kind of a famous one because it has a big garbage patch in the middle. You might have heard of the Great Pacific Garbage Patch. So you might have heard of that one. But here's what's cool. Right along the equator, that's where the solar radiation is the most intense, and so there's a lot of heating of the water here along the equator. But the water then, if we didn't have these oceans, it would just be that, the equator's super, super hot and the poles are incredibly cold. Much more dramatic than they are today. Of course, yes, the poles are the coldest parts on the planet today, and yes, the equator's the warmest, but it'd be much more dramatic if we didn't have the oceans. Because what the oceans do is they take some of that heat and they carry it in the form of hot water up north and down south, and then it cools at the poles, and then the cool water returns down. So this ocean and the ocean currents help to moderate global temperatures and increase sort of the zone of what we call zone of habitability. In other words, a zone of places where it's pretty nice to live. You could imagine if the water wasn't there, maybe this whole swath of the planet would be way too hot. Like right in here would be like just incredibly too hot. And then maybe a larger part of the world would be really, really cold. And so you'd have a very small region in which humans and most organisms could live. But that's not the case because because of these gyres, there's a much wider habitable zone on the planet. The next one, because water is really, really polar, it allows it to dissolve any other substance that is polar. In chemistry, we call water the universal solvent. Water will actually dissolve more variety of things than even the strongest acids that we have. For example, if we look at this salt, we know that if we drop salt into water, what happens is the salt just disappears, and we call it dissolves into the water. Now, why is that? Well, look at salt. Salt we learned last time was NaCl. The Na is positively charged, the Cl is minus, or negatively charged. So we could think of it sort of like a magnet too. And so we could say that it's polar. And I just told you that water will dissolve anything that's polar. So what happens is the positively charged ends of the water molecule are attracted to the negatively charged chlorine, and the negatively charged parts of the oxygen on the water molecule is attracted to the positively charged sodium. And these water molecules actually surround and separate these two ions, and you get what are fancily called hydration spheres. Essentially, you can have your chlorine ion surrounded by your water molecules, and your sodium ion surrounded by your water molecules. And it completely separates them, and that's why the salt disappears, it dissolves. Water is a great solvent. It dissolves lots of things. This allows for oxygen, carbon dioxide, nutrients like sugars, waste materials like ammonia, and a whole bunch of other things to just be able to be dissolved into the water. This allows cells to move things very efficiently. It allows our blood, which is mostly water, right? The plasma in our blood is pretty much water with stuff dissolved in it, to carry all sorts of nutrients and sugars and whatnot throughout our bodies. This picture is doing a nice job of showing that, right? You take a big chunk of salt, you drop it into the water, and what happens is these hydration spheres pull off the individual ions and the salt dissolves. Now, think about it. If I have, let's say, 1,000 mils of water, and I just start dropping salt into it, at first the salt disappears, right? The salt dissolves, but eventually, you've probably done this in class before, right? Or maybe at home or something. If you pour enough salt into it, what happens? Eventually the salt stops dissolving and it starts to just build up on the bottom. Now what's going on there? Why is the salt not dissolving? Well, imagine that 1,000 mils of water contained a certain number of molecules of water. And at some point, every one of those water molecules is already busy surrounding one of our ions. And so now we drop in new salt and there's no more water left to dissolve it. So how could I dissolve more salt? I just have to add more water molecules, and then they'd be able to continue to dissolve more salt. This is an important thing that you need to know. Somewhere near here, I want you to write, maybe kind of put brackets, and write this. This is the way it's described in chemistry. Like will dissolve like. What this simply means is this. If I have water, right, water is my example here, water, which is very polar, and I put in something else that's polar, like NaCl, it will dissolve. They'll mix. If I put two things that are nonpolar, like for example, oil is very, very nonpolar, and I add it to something else, like let's say iodine crystals that are also very nonpolar, they'll dissolve. But if I try to take water and add it to oil, which is very nonpolar, what happens? Will water and oil mix? No, they do not. They will not mix. In fact, oil is so nonpolar that it doesn't mix with the water at all. It just sits on top of the water, right? So what you need to know is that like will dissolve like. So we can test very simply if something's polar or not. If you put it in water and it dissolves, it must be polar because water's polar. If you put it in water and it doesn't mix, just like oil and water doesn't mix, then you must know that thing is nonpolar. So here's that example, right? If I take water and I pour the oil into it, it separates into these bubbles that go up to the top, and you get a layer of oil. I can take my spoon and stir it and stir it and stir it until I'm tired of stirring. All I'm going to do is chop it into smaller bubbles, which will then go back to the top and separate out again. The water and the oil simply will not mix because one is very nonpolar and the other is very polar, and polar and nonpolar won't mix. Remember, like dissolves like. The next one is called high surface tension. So this is really related to the fact that water, because it's like little magnets, it tends to want to stick together. And as a result, then the surface of the water forms, essentially you can think of it like a skin. You've experienced this, you've ever done a belly flop into water. You know that doing a belly flop into water, it hurts. It's like you're slapping, almost feels like you're slapping a solid. Well, what's happening when you do that belly flop is that when you hit the surface of the water, your body, the water molecules are actually resisting you entering into the water because those water molecules are attracted together, and so they don't want you to push them apart, right? Because your body is going to push them apart as you enter into the water. So there's some resistance there. This is why it doesn't matter if you're jumping off of a bridge. It doesn't matter if it's, if it's a certain height. It doesn't matter if it's from really landing in water or landing in concrete. It's going to have the same results, right? Which is catastrophic injury. Some insects actually take advantage of this. They can actually walk on water using the surface tension of water. Surface tension of water also causes water to clump into drops rather than spreading out into a thin layer. Next time you wash your car, notice that if your car has a good wax on it, nice and clean, that that water will bead up very nicely into these individual beads of dew, right, droplets of water. And so, that's because that water molecule is resisting gravity because the water molecules are attracted to each other. Now, water can also be attracted to other materials, and this is called adhesion. We'll look at that in a moment. But remember, water, because it's polar, is going to be attracted to anything else that has a charge to it. That's called adhesion. So here's a perfect example of surface tension. This glass of water, and you might have noticed this before, that if you take a glass of water, you can actually fill it slightly above the brim of the glass, and you actually get like a curve that you'll see. Think about it. Gravity is pushing down on this water. It wants to spill over the edge of the glass, but it can't because it's attracted to itself positively. And if you're very patient, you can do this at home. Take a glass of water, fill it up, and then very, very, very gently, carefully place a paperclip. And if you do it just right, you can actually get the paperclip to sit on the water. Notice this is not in the water at all. You can see the water surface is curved around this paperclip. It's sitting right on it. Here's the example of an insect. This one's called a water strider. And it lives pretty much its whole life on the surface of the water. And you can see its legs, right? That they're so light. These insects are so light, and they're spreading their weight out on 6 legs enough that the individual legs don't sink into the water. You get these curves of the water surface around the leg. There's another beautiful picture of it. You see these curves here. There's even a lizard. We'll see a video of this later. It's called the basilisk lizard. Sometimes it's called the Jesus Christ lizard. Now, it can't walk on water, but it can run on water. It can run fast enough that it can actually push off the surface of the water and run. Sort of like if you've ever seen The Incredibles, Dash, actually in one scene runs on the water. It's been estimated that people can do that. I forget if it's 70 miles an hour or 80 miles an hour. We'd have to be able to run that to do that, just like this lizard can. Here's a couple of beautiful pictures that show water's cohesive properties. Remember, cohesive means attracted to itself. Adhesive, think of like an adhesive like tape, right? It sticks to something else. So this is the cohesive property of water. You drop something into water, it doesn't just splash out. When you look at it under the slow motion, kind of high-speed imagery, what you see is that the water kind of rises together because it doesn't want to, separate from itself. Then it spreads out as this beautiful sheet, which then breaks into fingers, and then into individual droplets. And when you actually see videos of this, it's pretty amazing. You can see these water molecules just going kind of back and forth, trying to stick together. Another pretty picture there of it. Here's a picture of the droplets like I told you about. Remember, gravity's pushing down on this droplet. Gravity likes to spread this water out evenly on the leaf, but it's not because these water molecules are resisting the force of gravity to stick to each other because they're cohesive. Now, I want you to think about this. Imagine a gigantic tree, okay? Like there's huge trees that are several hundred feet tall. How much energy does it take to pull the water from its roots, right? Because you know that the water comes in through the roots of the tree, all the way up to the leaves where it's needed for photosynthesis. If you've ever tried to move water, water's really heavy, right? So how much energy does it take for a tree to pull that water up from the roots to the leaves? Right, so here's a picture. The huge tree, the water is going down from the roots, which you can't even see in this picture, but they're below here, right? All the way up through the tree, all the way to the leaves. Well, would you be surprised if I told you that it actually doesn't require any energy whatsoever by the tree? Here's essentially what happens. The cross section, if I were to chop this down and actually look at it under a microscope, what I'd see is that this trunk of the tree is riddled with these tiny little tubes. They look like little straws. Now water, remember, is cohesive to itself, but it's also adhesive. And what happens is the water is actually attracted to these walls and climbs up these tubes automatically. It's called capillary action. Make a note of that somewhere on your study guide. I want you to explain what I'm talking about here in a moment. But for now, just write capillary action. So what happens is this. Imagine this whole trunk is full of water. Right? There's water in these tubes. It extends all the way to the leaves. We'll learn in a couple units that these leaves have little holes in them called stomata, and sometimes the water evaporates through those openings, and as one water molecule leaves, it tugs on the next water molecule, which tugs on the next one, and the next one, the next one, the next one, all the way down. And that cohesive, the water tugging on itself, plus the adhesive nature that the water wants to spontaneously climb this, is what creates this capillary action that pulls the water up the tree. So the further you want the water to move, the smaller you have to have your tubes. Think about a graduated cylinder. Remember when we have our graduated cylinders and you are pouring water into them, that the water doesn't form a flat line, but it's kind of like this. We call it a meniscus. Why does that happen? Why does the water climb up, if you will, a little bit? It's the same adhesive property that's going on here. And what's cool is I take that graduated cylinder and make it smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller, down to the level of microscopic here, the water will climb and climb further and further. So that's what's really going on here with this capillary action. It's very, very cool. It allows for trees to do what they do and not have to spend a ton of energy moving water up them. We'll see this in the lab on the next time I see you. We'll actually take paper towels and the water will just climb this paper towel like a bridge from one place to another, just like it does in a tree. So surface tension and capillary action. Surface tension is related to the cohesive properties of water. In other words, those water molecules are sticking together, so they're resisting you entering them. The capillary action of the water climbing the tree is related mostly to its adhesive properties, though the cohesive properties do factor in a little bit, as I explained. The water being transported from the roots all the way down up to the leaves is called transpiration. This next idea is something that we'll introduce in this video and will come to be more important as we go through this, actually the entire year. It turns out that the shape of a molecule is very, very important to its function. Okay, you need to write this down somewhere on your study guide. You need to know this. The shape of a molecule relates to its function. One way to think of this is almost like a lock and a key. A key only works if it has just the right shape in order to actually get into the lock and unlock it. It has even a small change in this key might affect the fact that it doesn't work anymore. In much the same way, many of the molecules in your body, whether they're especially proteins, but not just limited to proteins, they have a specific shape that allows them to do a specific function. If something goes wrong with that shape, they won't work as well. Here's a classic example. We'll learn in the next unit about cells. We'll talk about the fact they're covered by these membranes, which you can think of almost like the skin of the cell. And there are specific proteins that are in that membrane that have just the right shape to let certain molecules and only those specific molecules through. And here's a kind of a cartoonish picture of what it looks like. Here's an actual representation of what the protein really truly looks like from the side. And then if you're actually looking down on it, if you're outside of the cell looking down at it, this is what it would look like. And it's got just the right shape opening, and it's going to interact with things as they go through, allowing only specific molecules to enter into the cell and not others. So pretty fascinating stuff. Another example, in your brain you have these cells called neurons. We'll learn about all this in much more detail at the end of the year in the nervous system unit. So you have these special cells called neurons, and they communicate across these gaps called synapses by releasing chemicals that are special chemicals that stimulate these neurons. Some of these chemicals you might have heard of, like dopamine, for example. And so they travel across this gap and they bind to the receptors on the other side. And they have to have just the right shape in order to stimulate just the right receptor and cause the correct response. Here's an example. There are natural endorphins in your body, and they look like this. And these things are released whenever you're experiencing a pleasurable sensation. It essentially makes you feel good, it makes you feel relaxed. And really the part that's the most important as far as what actually binds to the cell is this part right here. This is the part that actually binds to the receptor and causes the response. Now there are other chemicals that are not made in our body, like morphine, for example, which if you compare this part is shaped very, very similarly to this part. So if I were to give somebody morphine, it actually stimulates the brain the same way that an endorphin would. So we use morphine as a painkiller. Someone's been in an auto accident or something like that, and they're obviously not releasing a bunch of endorphins right now because they're in incredible pain. I can essentially trick their brain by giving them morphine, and their brain, experiences that like it would, a bunch of endorphins, and so it calms the person, alleviates the pain, they feel more happy. Now, of course, people can become addicted to not just morphine, but a whole host of painkillers and other narcotics because their brain essentially gets used to the stimulation from those chemicals as they would endorphins. Okay, so kind of interesting little example there of how the shape, right? It's really the shape of this molecule that allows it to do its function. Here's another picture that kind of shows it. So you've got the brain cell, and the natural endorphin and the morphine are both stimulating the same receptor because they have very, very similar shapes. Another example can be drawn from this. This is a cough syrup. So this picture is just here to kind of remind you about this whole shape affecting function, but we're not talking about morphines and endorphins anymore. So cough syrup. Cough syrup is often supposed to taste like it is cherry flavored, yeah? But let's think about this for a second. Are there really cherries ground up in this stuff, do you think? I'm hoping you're realizing no. Your brain, when you're tasting this, your brain knows, okay, they're going for cherry flavor, but it's not cherry. I'm not eating cherries. Now how does this work? Well, believe it or not, the way this actually works as far as taste is that on your tongue you have what are called taste buds, and they are responding to the shape of molecules and then sending specific signals to your brain that your brain has learned to interpret as sweet or salty or whatever name we've given it. Spicy, oh, it's cherry flavored, and so forth. Now, what biochemists have been able to do is isolate what molecules in cherry actually give it that particular flavor sensation in your brain. And then they've been able to synthesize them artificially. You may have heard of an artificial flavoring before. They're in all kinds of candies and so forth, right? And so what they do then is they take those molecules and they put them in stuff they don't want to have taste bad, right? Because normally cough medicine would taste pretty bad, but you throw this artificial flavoring in there, and now your brain is essentially getting the bad tasting chemicals, but it's also getting these cherries, which most people like cherry, right? And so then you get this flavor, and your brain knows, okay, this is not just cherry, this is something else. But your brain is sophisticated enough that it can recognize that, okay, it's supposed to be going for a cherry flavor, but it's not natural cherries. So there's just a couple examples of how shape affects function. We'll see a lot more examples, especially in this unit, especially when we get into enzymes. So we'll learn the fact that the enzymes have just the right shape in order to actually do their function. So I hope that video helped. I'll see you next time.